Hello, I'm Spencer Black. I'll be presenting today on Dutch and Native American interactions in the colony of New Netherland during the 1600s. I started off by figuring out the topic I wanted to research, which, from some of the research that we had done in class previously, I decided that I would base my research off of the way the Dutch and the Native Americans interacted during this period in the colony itself. I took a couple approaches to this. I looked at the cultural areas where they would interact, as well as some of the political areas and why they interacted the ways they did, both Native Americans and the Dutch themselves. So I started my thesis. My thesis went: the Dutch and Native Americans' interactions reflect many of the stereotypes that both sides believed and built an atmosphere of misunderstanding and distrust, which led to patterns in both sides' behaviors and attitudes to one another. That took a lot of refining before I actually was able to get that down to as narrow as it was. But I started with the historiography. I went and I looked at what other historians in the field had done and how they advanced the study of Dutch and Native American relationships in New Netherland. I went to Paul Otto. He had quite a bit to say about the cultural aspect with his book, The Dutch-Munsee Encounter in America, The Struggle for Sovereignty in the Hudson Valley, and discusses a lot of cultural changes, the formation of frontiers between people. That was helpful for getting a cultural view on how the Dutch and Native Americans interacted. I also went with Job Jacobs. He was very helpful in some of the political aspects as well as used heavily on Maud Wilder Goodwin. She has a very good account of the political aspects that govern some of the relationships between the Native Americans and the Dutch in this time. Donna Merriwick, she also has a lot of stuff to say about the cultural aspects and interactions. Alexandra Van Dongen, she also has quite a bit to say in a book that's titled One Man's Trash is Another Man's Treasure, and it's actually a collection of articles that covers the Dutch and Native American cultural material relationships that they had developed between trade and various aspects there. And I looked at what they had done, and one of them, all the evidence from one author would point to the cultural relationships. Another author would point to the geopolitical aspects of the interactions that took place. And to understand how the relationships developed the way they did, I thought it'd be more important to look at both the cultural and the political, and to get those into a perspective that will let people understand better how things went the way they went. And so I tried to combine both approaches into one, and to get a fuller understanding of what was going on. And so I went through and started doing my research just to find out. I went through a lot of the class documents in the archive. I went through several of the books of the library that were on the list, the ebook list as well. That was very helpful. I went and I tried to get some stuff from the early period when they first started the colony and for some of the first discovery, all the way to the English occupation later on. And so I started off with kind of just a little bit of background information on each and how the cultures were different from each other. And I found quite a bit of information. They were very different from each other. The cultures were not remotely similar, but both were deeply, I guess you could say that they were similar in one aspect. They were both deeply religious. Various Native American groups and the Dutch as well. When I looked at the Dutch, though, I saw that they would base some of their interactions off the Native Americans with a sense of appeasement. They weren't always cooperative, but they were told by the company, the Dutch West India Company, that they needed to be cooperative with the Native Americans, and some of the colonial regulations that stated that they needed to take care to not offend the Native Americans. I'll read an excerpt from one of them right here. Take special care when in trading or in other matters faithfully to fulfill their promises to the Indians or other neighbors, and not to give them any offense without cause as regards to their person, wives, or property, on pain of being rigorously punished therefor. And this was just in the first initial provisional regulations that governed the colony. The Dutch made several more, and they used these to govern the people's interactions with the Native Americans to ensure that there would be peace, trade, and that there wouldn't be, there would be still a foothold in the colony of New Netherland. Clearly, the Dutch were outnumbered by the Native Americans, and they did not want to anger anybody. They were not going to be quick to anger anybody in order to lose that foothold. Some of the primary sources that I used was Adrian van der Donck. He was very helpful in getting a Eurocentric perspective of the Native Americans, which a lot of the records I looked at were stories from the Europeans that some of them had recorded from Native Americans. John Heckenweiler had a very good account of the history of the manners of the Native Americans that occupied the area. Some of the other things that I noticed about the Dutch were that they weren't your typical European colonizers. They were a little more humanitarian. Jacobs in his book talks about how they were more accepting of religious things in their colony. That didn't necessarily apply to the Native Americans as much. Lots of evidence from van der Donck and from some of the other accounts of the religious contemporaries at the time. They don't speak very highly of the Native American religion. They don't speak very highly of the way they worship or what they worship, how they worship. They don't really speak highly of the Native Americans. And they often call them blind heathens. It's just the way the Dutch didn't really see eye to eye with the native religion practices. So that would make it hard for the Dutch to interact with the natives on a spiritual sense and get a good understanding. One of the quotes from Adrian van der Donck was, "They are all heathens who have no particular religion or devotion, and no idols or images they venerate, let alone worship." So he didn't really understand how Native American religion worked and how their spirituality affected the way they did things. So to me, that showed that clearly the Native Americans weren't understood by the Dutch, so it gave the Dutch a bad taste in their mouth for the Native American practices. He wasn't alone. Van der Donck was not alone in his opinion of the Native American religion, and there were several contemporaries. Reverend Jonas Michaelis, he also was one who had a bad opinion of the Native American religion. He says, "The Native Americans were entirely savage and wild, strangers to all decency, yea, uncivil and stupid as garden bulls." So we can see that he didn't have a high opinion of them. He'd probably been out there trying to convert them, and he lived with them, lived in the colony and dealt with the Indians. Native Americans is pretty common, but he did not have a high opinion of them, and that certainly affected the way that he would interact with them culturally, which that's where I categorize the religion as more of a cultural aspect than a political thing. Several other things happened where the Dutch were trying to convert the Native Americans, and it just didn't work out for them because they couldn't see eye to eye with them. They had wanted to take Native American children. If I can find that quote really quick, they wanted to take Native American children and separate them so they could train them to be Dutch people, basically, and have them not be interference with the Native American practices. And he says, actually van der Donck writes this, he says that public authority ought to become involved and provide for sound teaching of our language and the elements of the Christian religion to their youth in good schools. So the Dutch didn't want to have to deal with the Native Americans as the Native Americans were. They wanted to convert them, change them over to Dutchmen, and basically deal with them that way. So that was how I took the approach to the cultural aspect. I took the way they did the religious breakdown, the way they did their conversions, several things like that. I did go into some of the political aspects as well. The Dutch didn't see eye to eye often when it came to political aspects. And the best example of this was Kieft's War. Kieft's War was not entirely everyone's fault. It was mostly just Kieft. For most of the evidence I found was from De Vries, and he did not have a high opinion of Kieft, so he believed that Kieft was just didn't want to listen to him, didn't want to take their advice, and on the Council of 12. So he just goes on and has this whole spiel to say about Kieft and how Kieft was wrong for what he did. And he goes in and just talks about how the whole war was pretty much Kieft's fault. And it's quite biased, or there can be a bias in it, but it still paints a good picture that we can understand that Kieft was not very savvy when it came to politically dealing with the Native Americans. And so that's where I kind of looked at. I looked at Kieft's war, the religious aspects, some of the conversion attempts, some of the other early contact period where there was some violence with Hudson's voyage and some other attempts to make contact with the Native Americans that didn't go so well. And basically, I believe that the way that the worldview that the Native Americans had didn't allow them to be very accepting of the Dutch culture, and the worldview that the Dutch had didn't make them very accepting of Native American culture. Both sides had positive and negative things to say about each other, but mostly, from what I read, it was mostly negative for the most part. But they didn't see eye to eye, and it was because they just couldn't understand one another's culture, either politically or culturally, I guess is what you say. And I found that if they could have just got past these basic differences, they could have had a lot more prosperous interactions. And that pretty much sums up my paper, and I guess that's about it. I don't really have much more. Thank you for listening.